Hello everybody, my name is Sniping is Fun. I welcome you all back to my next top 10 list here on YouTube. And going off what I did with my previous top 10 list, my top 10 favorite anime villains, I wanted to talk about another set of villains that are some of my favorite of all time. This time, the genre is video games, with my top 10 favorite video game villains. And we go over why I like these villains and what I'm interested in these top 10 villains and honorable mentions. And without further ado, let's get this started and let's get on to my number 10 on this list of my top 10 favorite video game villains. Number 10 goes to Neo Cortex from the Crash Bandicoot series. Now, Neo Cortex is a classic villain, not only in the gaming world, but also for me because it was, my childhood basically. Like I mentioned on the PlayStation All-Stars list and the game franchise Need to Come Back top 10 list, I grew up with Crash Bandicoot. I loved the first three Crash Bandicoots on the PlayStation 1, and Neo Cortex being the major villain of all three. Obviously, I would have to come across him and fight him and get to know the character and whatnot. And he is an enjoyable villain. He's like that villain that he's not too intimidating. He's not really evil, but he's a bad guy that still wants to go out and take over the world and destroy Crash and do all that stuff. And he does have that crazy scientist personality about him, and he is Neo Cortex. There's nothing really else you can basically say about him, except it was an interesting, basically villain. Has a personality. It's that whimpering, sniveling, villain that, when they're losing, they cry a lot, and they basically, they're weak. They're not really a strong villain, and that's, it's an archetype that I'm a fan of to some extent. I don't like those type of villains as often, but a cartoony villain like him who, he could be a threat, but at the same time he's semi-likable, and he's not really a major threat at the same point because he's basically almost a coward, and, when he's getting beat, he shows it. So that type of villain is cool, and I'll give it to Neo Cortex because he's a classic for me. He's not one of my favorite villains of all time, which is the reason why, he's not one of my top favorite villains of all time. That's the reason why he's number 10. He still is an enjoyable villain, though. In his classic status, alongside playing the games and getting to know his character and liking his personality and how he presents himself as a villain, grants him my number 10 spot. Now let's get on to number 9 on this list. Andross from the Star Fox series, because he is pretty intimidating in all his incarnations. Star Fox NES, 64, Adventure, I believe that's 0. I haven't played that game yet. This former scientist of the Lilat system that was basically banished from the realm and then becomes some evil power of himself, making himself a giant floating head with hands, trying to take over the Lilat system and destroy all the planets and whatever the heck he was, flipping Andross. And he was a fairly likable villain because, the whole build-up to fighting him in any Star Fox game is pretty... Star Fox doesn't have too much of a story, at least early on. I think they really started adding story when you got to Adventures and Command and whatnot. Building up more story in the universe with Crystal and all the extra characters. But when it was straight up just Andross taking over the Lilat system, it was basically just him and how threatening he was with him being banished like that, doing what powers he could and all his scientific breakthroughs or whatever the heck he did to make himself a giant floating head, which I don't know how he did that. But the fact that he did do that seems to make him threatening because he could float all over the place and blast everyone with his freaking laser hands and destroy the entire universe. Okay, but he's an intimidating villain, and when you get to fight him in any games, at least he gives you a slight intimidation factor when you fight him, which could make some players uncomfortable. And then when you finally get that thrill of actually beating him in any game, you beat Andross, you save the Lilat system. And he is a classic in the video game world, and for me specifically, because I remember renting the Super Nintendo Star Fox game back in the day, and it was enjoyable, and I really, really, truly played the 64 game by myself, and years later, but then originally, like, with my friend, I always would go over to his house, and outside of Ocarina of Time and whatnot, Star Fox 64 was one of the top games we would basically be playing on the Nintendo 64, and Adventures was cool, and I have yet to see Star Fox Zero, but I will get to that one day. And he still is basically the same Andros as back then. And it's flipping Andros. He is a gaming classic and a Nintendo classic too. So Andros is my number 9. Let's get on to my number 8 favorite villain for video games. Bowser from the Mario series. Now, I really do like Bowser. I am a Mario fan. I like him a lot because he is a classic villain, and you see him in all these different roles. The major reason why he's not super high on my list is because he is kind of a bland villain. He is the cliche, just kidnap the damsel in distress and always get beaten, and he has comedic relief to him, and he's not like a major threat. But that's obviously also Mario, so I'm not going to discredit him too much for that. But he's kind of bland, and he's just like villain, captures princess and gets beaten by plumber type caricature, and he hasn't really become anything different than that outside the side games, outside Paper Mario, outside Mario and Luigi, outside all the Mario RPG spin-off side stuff, which gives him more personality than a lot of the main Mario games do. And he is a cool villain because he's a classic, and especially for me because I grew up with the Super Nintendo, still playing Mario World and All Stars and whatnot, 64 and everything on the Nintendo 64, and he is a cool villain. He's just not one of my top 10, super high up in my top 10 favorite villains. He's loved enough by me and a favorite enough by me to be on the list, but not super high enough to the point where he would be, top 5. Like, he is enjoyable. I do like the Mario series. He is a cool villain, a cool character from Nintendo and video game in general for a villain, but he's not that interesting enough and not that unique enough to be any higher because his motive is 9 times out of 10 just kidnap the princess. And more often than not, you don't really get to play as him except for like Bowser's Inside Story and like Mario RPG and stuff like that. And the side games, obviously, but I'm not going to really count those. Bowser is an enjoyable villain for me, just not top 5 material. But he's still a good villain. In one of my favorites. So let's get on to my number 7. M. Bison from the Street Fighter series. Oh, M. Bison. Fighting you in Street Fighter 2 was such a pain in the ass. You were so hard to beat. Oh, M. Bison. Yeah, M. Bison's a pretty cool villain. Like, the major villain from pretty much the Street Fighter series, at least the majority of them. And he's the major rival of, like, Chun-Li and Ryu and Guile and whatnot, the big whole Shadow Lu leader. He has this intimidating factor about him, which makes him a pretty cool villain. And like I said, I do like villains that are intimidating, whether they're intimidated by just looking like a badass, or intimidated by being creepy, or intimidated by being mysterious, or whatever you want to say. He has like all this power to him, and he shows it. He has Shadow Lu. He's trying to take over the world or whatever, or make clones of himself apparently and stuff like that. He's such a hard boss usually, at least in Street Fighter 2. He's a major hard boss, and his moveset is pretty cool to play as, and his personality being as taking over the world, of course, ruling the world type thing is pretty cliche, but M. Bison is a classic in it, and he did it before it was really cool, or before it was a normally used thing like all the time in video games or whatever. So I'm giving number 7 to M. Bison because the nostalgia of me getting my butt kicked so much by him in Street Fighter 2, him being so hard, his cool personality, his cool, intimidating, major villain, I'm going to rule the world or destroy it or whatever, about him. And the fact is, freaking M. Bison, he's a classic, and I do love the Street Fighter series. So I had to put a Street Fighter villain on here, and he's the one that stuck with me the most. So that's number 7. So let's get on to number 6 on this list. Albert Wesker from Resident Evil, another Capcom franchise. And Wesker is just so cool. I really, really liked Wesker. In Resident Evil 1, he's part of like STARS, but he's like a double agent, and he turns against you, and the turning against you part was actually pretty cool, and it did make him threatening, and he is a threatening villain, and he has like he's like a mastermind type thing. He kind of is like behind the scenes affecting everything, which is a villain I like. Like I mentioned in my anime list, I like the villains that are like masterminds that either, and that could go two ways. And like in the anime one, I basically talk about villains who are controlling things behind the scenes and not getting involved. But then there's also those mastermind type villains that are involved, but behind the scenes without being known, actually get stuff done. And while he was pretending to be a member of STARS and faking out STARS and whatever, he was doing his entire mission to, with all the T-virus and stuff like an umbrella and everything, and he just became intimidating. And then he gets all his, powers and Code Veronica / Code Veronica X, and he becomes a major threat in Resident Evil 5, and he can do some weird shadow sliding Neo type moves from the Matrix type thing, and he just becomes even cooler with the powers, which it takes away from him in a way because he starts off as an intimidating human villain without like any powers, but then when he gets the powers, it's like it could degrade him a bit because now he's like, I can do all this crazy stuff to destroy the world or whatever. But he's still pretty much the same freaking Albert Wesker, just now I can do all this stuff to take over the world, which it adds to him too because he becomes more intimidating because he's not just a random soldier, he's a random soldier that has all these biological powers from like the T-virus or whatever virus, and stuff. And it being one of the major threats of the Resident Evil series, it's pretty cool. He's a pretty cool villain, and I had to include him because of his intimidation factor alone, regardless, later Wesker with the powers or early Wesker just because he's intimidating and, evil. And maybe one day we could see him brought back in the series. He died in 5, but this is freaking Resident Evil, people. You can always come back. Now let's get on to my top 5 of my favorite video game villains with number 5. Dr. Wily from Mega Man. Oh, look! 3 Capcom villains in a row. You know why? Because Capcom actually has some really freaking good villains. Or at least they used to, before they went... Dr. Wily from Mega Man. It's kind of like the whole Neo Cortex thing. Like, he's this evil, mad scientist that, he's threatening on the outside, but he's basically a cowardly old man. Like, on the inside, he's like, if he's getting beaten, he's begging him, no, Mega Man, don't forgive me, I turned good now, stop it now. And he just becomes like a crying baby that just, he becomes like a comedic joke villain when he gets beaten. But when he's like, oh, I have all my 8 robot masters, and I'm riding my giant machine, and I'm going to blow you all up, he's pretty intimidating to an extent. And he's a classic. Like, I love the Mega Man series. That's the whole thing. I love the Mega Man series. Now, I might a little bit enjoy the X series more than the original, which would be weird because I put Dr. Wily on this list instead of Sigma. But Dr. Wily is more of a classic villain, more of an iconic villain, and something I find a little bit more interesting than someone like Sigma. Sigma is like this all-powerful, evil Reploid robot dude that, just is evil, but Dr. Wily at least has some more personality beyond just being evil. He's kind of comedic and funny, and he's been around longer, and he's just an enjoyable villain. What else can I really say? Number 4 on my top 10 favorite video game villains list is Giovanni from the Pokemon series. Now, here's the thing. When I was thinking about Giovanni, he was also in consideration for my anime list, but he was in higher consideration for my video game list because he is more interesting and has done more stuff in the Pokemon video games. The reason why I did not consider him in the long term to actually put him on my favorite anime villains list is because outside the 2 Mewtwo movies and maybe a little bit of the TV series, Giovanni does jack all in the Pokemon anime. He is not really even there, nor is he really all that interesting there, besides the 2 Mewtwo movies. Giovanni in the video games, though, although I would say when it comes to Pokemon Origins, they made a really good Giovanni in Pokemon Origins. He was, because he was so closely tied to the video game Giovanni. But Giovanni, the leader of Team Rocket, he was a major threat in the first one, and then he, you know, you beat it and he disbands the group, and then he comes back in Gold and Silver, and then his son's Silver, and then he's trying to do that, and then he's still like a major Pokemon battle that you can fight in pretty much like almost every single game. He's always like a secret battle. I know he wasn't Black and White or Black and White 2. I know he kind of still shows up. So there's still maybe some story there technically with his character. He is around longer in the video games to be more of a memorable character, and he's a mafia boss. He's a badass, and he's really cool in the video games in Pokemon Origins. In the anime, the main anime series, it's hit or miss, but he's not really there anymore because Team Rocket, outside of Jesse and James, who are comedic relief entirely now, like, Team Rocket's not a major threat in this series anymore, so we don't get to see him at all, so his entire point is pretty much useless in the anime now. But in the video games, he still shows up, and in the video games, he's a cool character, and in the video games, he's actually intimidating. And he's my number 4. Now let's get on to my number 3 favorite video game villain. Ansem from the Kingdom Hearts series. Now, Kingdom Hearts is one of my favorite video game series of all time, especially one of my favorite RPGs. Ansem is a major villain throughout the majority of it. And I'm going to kind of throw, I guess, Xehanort and whatever into this list, but I'm mostly talking about Ansem, like from the original first Kingdom Hearts. But technically, since he's based off the one scientist guy, who's based off this guy, who's based off that guy, and this guy's nobody, and this guy's heartless, and whatever, I guess it all does date back to Xehanort, so you can include Xehanort in this position alongside Ansem as well, but this is mostly for the Kingdom Hearts 1 Ansem, because he is a pretty intimidating, shadowy figure that pretty much hides in the shadows, controls all the Heartless and the worlds, and you Sora, and you lock him up with a Keyblade, and you fight him at the end. He's pretty intimidating. He's a cool villain. He's the voice actor, you know. I can't remember his name now. I know who it is. I can't remember his name. The dude. Oh, jeez. The voice that they got in English was really freaking awesome, and it makes it intimidating. And it's freaking Ansem, and he's built up pretty well throughout Kingdom Hearts 1, and then the whole connection in Kingdom Hearts 2 and the rest of the games to Xehanort and everything. He's a major threat. The whole universe of Kingdom Hearts is a major threat by this villain. But Ansem is cool. That's it. He's intimidating. He's cool. He's a threat. He controls from behind the scenes. He's a mastermind. There's different various personalities of him when it's related to, like, Zenos and Xehanort and Young whatever and all these different renditions of him. Who really cares? It's Kingdom Hearts and it's convoluted as all hell. But it's awesome at the same time. And Ansem is my number 3. So let's get on to my number 2. Ocelot from Metal Gear Solid series. Now this is basically all 3 major renditions of him. Younger, slightly older, oldest. In Metal Gear Solid 1, he was very intimidating, old, like, Revolver, like, sharpshooter type, you know, character, and he was pretty freaking cool. He was really awesome in Metal Gear Solid 3, just seeing him younger and seeing how the personality was, well, it's still very similar, kind of different when he was younger compared to when he was older. When he was younger in, like, the Cold War versus, you know, Metal Gear Solid 1 takes place 90s or early 2000s, I forgot now. He's an older man, so seeing how much he's improved and how much of a character he is. And I have not played Metal Gear Solid 5 yet, so I really don't know too much about this rendition of him yet. But I've seen stuff about him, and he's a pretty cool character in his own right. And he is like the major villain, really, in the Metal Gear Solid series. He really, truly is. He is the major villain. And he's so, from day one, when you play Metal Gear Solid 1, you see him as this intimidating old man that's a sharpshooter type character that could just shoot you and take you out, even though he's like 60, 70 years old. And then you see him when he's younger in the Cold War in the 60s, and you see he still can do all this crap, like, you know, what he learned back then, he knows when he's older, and just see where he came from. And then you see him even older, and then when you get to Metal Gear Solid 4, and he's even older than Metal Gear Solid 1, and he's supposedly like Liquid Snake and all these things, and fight Snake up in the final battle, he is just such an intimidating, cool, awesome villain. And that's the reason why he's on there. And Metal Gear Solid is one of my favorite series, and I really like his rendition in Metal Gear Solid 3, which is, I think, my favorite in the series. And he's so iconic, he's been around long enough, he has a cool personality, he's intimidating, but an intimidating factor where he can be intimidating behind the scenes, but also intimidating straight up to your face. And that is Revolver, Ocelot, and he's my number 2. Now, before we get on to my number 1, like always, I'm going to be presenting to all of you some honorable mentions that, while not on the list, come this close to being on the list, and essentially, regardless of their top 10 or not, they are still some of my favorite video game villains of all time, and I hope you enjoy it. Jack of Blades from Fable 1. Now, he was pretty intimidating, he creeped you out a bit, he was mysterious, and then you fight him in the end in a pretty cool battle, and if you played the Fable, what was it, Anniversary or whatever one, the Legends or whatever it's called, you can basically take his mask. He's just pretty intimidating and cool. And it was a pretty fun final battle. Like, the first Fable actually ended pretty well. I never really played any Fables after that. But the first Fable, I think, ended on a pretty good note. Mr. Sandman from Punch-Out. Specifically, I think he was in the Super Nintendo one, right? I know he's in the Wii one. He's such an intimidating character. Like, when you get to him. When I remember playing years ago when I played the Punch-Out on the Wii, I had to try like 30, 40, 50 times to beat this guy because he's pretty freaking hard. And like and it's so intimidating when you go see him beat every other character in the game before you fight him in this little like intro video hyping you up for your fight. All these people that you pretty much had hard times fighting, you probably had to try over and over and over again. He just plows right through them, which makes him so intimidating, and then you fight him and he kicks your butt. So, yeah. Ripto from Spyro Dragon, because he is actually a fairly interesting villain, and he's around in some of the later games, and he's like that somewhat cowardly villain that actually, you know, is intimidating. He uses his henchmen, and he gets what he wants, really, and he's actually the villain that kind of stands out to me from the Spyro Dragon series. The dude from, I forgot what his name was, from the first one was kind of and then the lady from the third one was decent. But he's like the standout villain, especially for me, you know, growing up with Spyro the Dragon, and for a villain in there. Janebolo from Saints Row 2, I should specifically say. The businessman that manipulates every other gang the Saints go after in Saints Row 2. And then you get up to the top of his building, you bust a cap in his face, and you send him flying out of his skyscraper to the cement. Oh, I'm sorry if I spoiled it for you. He was such a cool villain because he was intimidating as a normal human businessman that just wanted to kill off the Saints, basically. He worked with like all the other gangs, and he was just like behind the scenes until you really got to the final missions. And then he really starts to go after you. And he's so cool. And then they had to screw everything up with Get Out of Hell, but making him like a demon devil person in hell. Yeah, I mean, it makes sense because he's a bad guy, but he was cooler in Saints Row 2. Mellowface from Xenoblade Chronicles, because he is such a cool giant robot, and without saying anything to spoil it for you guys, who he actually is, he is intimidating and threatening, and he starts the game off by really making you, fight a major threat at the beginning of the game. Zenos, because Zenos is cool. Ansem is cooler, but Zenos was such an awesome character in Kingdom Hearts 2 in the final battle with him when you're teaming up with Riku. Yeah, boy. Majora, because Majora from Majora's Mask, and I'm saying Majora specifically because it's not really Skull Kid all that much. The Mask is more the villain than Skull Kid, and the Mask is technically, taking over Skull Kid anyway, so Majora. Because Majora is creepy and intimidating and a really fun battle to fight with. Liquid Snake. Ocelot's cooler, but Liquid Snake in Metal Gear Solid 1 was a pretty cool villain and built up well as Solid Snake's brother, and that's really all about it. So now we are done with the honorable mentions. before we get on to number 1, let's have a nice drum roll, please, to build up my number 1 favorite video game villain. Is Ganondorf from Legend of Zelda. Might be a cliche choice, but Ganondorf is not just my favorite like Nintendo villain, but my favorite pretty much video game villain of all time because he is such a cool character. Interesting backstory, growing up in the Gerudo, Gerudo Valley with all the Gerudo women, and he's basically like the only guy there, and he was born in the desert, and he was destined to rule or something like that. He gets his hand on the power and turns himself into Ganon. He's just a major threat in the majority of the Zelda games. Classic, iconic villain in the gaming scene in general, dating all the way back to the 80s. And it's freaking Ganondorf. Like, Legend of Zelda is one of my favorite video game series of all time, and almost every rendition of him is pretty freaking cool. Ocarina of Time, cool. Twilight Princess, cool. Wind Waker, cool. Every other version is cool. Like, he's that dedicated villain that always wants to come back and take over Hyrule. And all these different renditions of him, Phantom Ganon, all him turning into Ganon, being Ganondorf, fighting all these different renditions of Link, trying to stop all these different, descendants of the Zelda, the royal family. Ganondorf is just freaking awesome. And that's why he is my number 1 favorite video game villain. Now, hope you guys like this video. Put in the comment section what you guys think. What do you guys think of my list? Who are some of your favorite video game villains of all time? Let's compare and contrast at the bottom. Have a nice fun discussion. And that's it for this video. Peace. Please subscribe if you want to. Have a lovely day like always. And I will see you all in my next video. Bye.